name is Glenn Gerstner. I currently serve as the interim dean of the Leslie H. and William L. Collins College of Professional Studies, where I'm also an associate professor of sport management. I want to welcome you all here. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Rizzo, associate professor and director of our journalism program, as well as the students at The Torch, the official student newspaper of St. John's, for putting together such an exciting and timely program. And of course, extra special thanks to our panelists who have taken time at the end of a busy workday, one which is probably not over for most of them, to share their wisdom with us. I take extra pride in serving as interim dean because I'm a CCPS alumnus myself, class of 1981, when our college was called St. Vincent's College. St. Vincent's was an apt name because I often tell students that while they study at St. John's, the most important thing they might learn is how to live the Vincentian mission, by being sure to help those who may lack in economic, physical, or social advantages. At St. John's, we take this quite seriously on our own mission statement. We seek to foster a worldview and to further efforts towards global harmony and development by creating an atmosphere in which all people can prosper and embody the spirit of compassionate concern for others, so characteristic of St. Vincent. Tonight's conversation relates directly to one of the 6 core values of St. John's University, namely truth. And in case you were wondering, the other 5 are love, respect, opportunity, excellence, and service. The Webster's definition of truth is that which is in accordance with fact or reality. You know, there's an old saying, all you have in this life is your name and your word. Now, I first heard that applied to those who work in finance, referring to securities dealers who make deals based on nothing but their word. But I believe it's also key to successful journalism. And like the rest of you, I'm interested in hearing what our panelists have to say about how truth dovetails with media literacy. It's an important issue as information travels faster and looser than ever before. Most of the public, including myself, find it harder to distinguish between facts, alternate facts, and lies. So please listen carefully to our panelists. They have decades of media experience that they're here to share with you. And thanks again to each of them for participating, and please enjoy the conversation. I'll turn it back over to Professor Rizzo.
Thank you, Dean. So as the director of the journalism program, I also thank all of you for participating in this event. I just want to say journalism faces challenges today, but these can be overcome with dedication to this craft, dedication to ethical journalism, and a dedication to practicing the skills to properly communicate the news. All our student media outlets at St. John's aim to do that, and that tradition is certainly embodied in The Torch that tells the stories of people and events both on and off campus. Media literacy has another component. It calls for news consumers to support freedom of the press and legitimate journalists doing the work needed to keep us informed. Your presence here tonight embraces that. I now turn over our event to our graduating editors from The Torch, Jillian Ortiz, managing editor, and Dara Santana, editor-in-chief of St. John's independent student newspaper, The Torch. Dara, it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor Rizzo, and thank you to Dean Gerstner, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As Professor Rizzo said, my name is Dara Santana, and I'm joined by Jillian Ortiz, and we're both outgoing members of The Torch's 98th editorial board. A little bit about The Torch before we begin. The Torch is St. John University's only independent newspaper, nearing its 100th year on Queens campus. We are independent, meaning we function completely separately from the university, from the Collins College of Professional Studies, and from the journalism program. We are not funded by the university, nor are we a budgeted organization. So unlike other orgs, we do not receive any sort of budget from SGI, nor do we have an advisor who is a member of the journalism program or any other university department. We'd really like to thank the journalism program as well as Professor Rizzo for partnering with The Torch for this important conversation this evening. And I will pass it on to Jillian for a brief note before we get speaking to Michelle.
Thank you, Dara, and thank you again to everyone in attendance. Since my freshman year, I've long planned on hosting some kind of university-wide torch event to kind of bridge the gap between the torch and the university community. And here we are 4 years later, and we're all joined by Suzanne, the editor-in-chief that pioneered myself and back then the 95th e-board through the first kind of journalistic conflict I've ever experienced. And Dara and I, as leaders of the 98th e-board, experienced something similar this summer, and we knew we never wanted it to happen again to another e-board. So the point of this conversation is to kind of work toward that goal by creating a space where, you know, journalists, aspiring journalists, and consumers of news alike can kind of gain a better understanding of, you know, the media and why it operates the way it does and how we all react and engage with that. And again, I just want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Rizzo and CCPS, for making this even a possibility. And most importantly, thank you all for attending and caring enough about this important conversation. We hope that you'll walk away with, you know, a new understanding and appreciation for the media that you consume, whether it's on a local or international level. And the way this event is kind of laid out tonight, we're going to start off by, you know, laying the foundation, you know, what is media literacy. Then we'll kind of move into seeing how, you know, media literacy takes place in action in newsrooms and on the consumer standpoint, and then kind of bridge into where do we take all of that from here. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Dara.
So this evening, we're joined by some amazing panelists, including Joy Brown, who's a Newsday columnist who has been with the publication since 1983, working in roles such as reporter, editor, newsroom administrator, and editorial writer. She also attended George Washington University. We also have Suzanne Chichalski, social news gathering reporter with NBC News, and SJU alumna, and a former Torch editor-in-chief.
And also joining us tonight is Mary Calvi, a 12-time New York Emmy-winning broadcast journalist. You likely know her for her breaking news coverage at CBS 2 and is the weekend anchor of Inside Edition. And she graduated from Syracuse University with a broadcast journalism degree. And we're also joined by Michelle Chula-Lipkin, the executive director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education, who received both her undergraduate and graduate education at NYU and has grown namely into the most prominent media literacy education association in the United States. And she'll be starting us off today by laying the foundation for the event. So with all that, Michelle, would you be able to kind of provide us with a definition of media literacy? Is there a flat definition? Is that even possible? And I know we have slides prepared, so I'm going to share the screen for that.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. This is very wonderful to be invited to talk with everyone. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So I was tasked with just kind of laying the framework for media literacy the way that my organization namely sees it, as well as giving you a little information about our network and our community, and then talk a little bit about how we frame conversations around things like fake news. So Jillian, I was having trouble sharing, which, you know, happens. And I shared my slides with you if you can share them. If not, I'll just, you know, go with it and start talking.
Yeah, sorry, just one moment.
No worries.
I am also trying to access that. Would not be a virtual event if not for a technical glitch.
Well, I'll just keep going, and when they pop up, everyone will be so happy and surprised. As Jillian mentioned, Namely is actually the largest membership organization committed to media literacy education around the globe. We're a national nonprofit, although a third of our members are actually from the international community. And we've been in existence since 1997. And we spend every day working towards a vision to see media literacy highly valued and widely practiced as an essential life skill. And so the way that we define media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So in the simplest terms, media literacy builds upon the foundation of traditional literacy. So when you think about what does it mean to be a literate person today, we need to know how to read and consume and author with all our devices and media means of communication. The way that we describe the purpose of media literacy is to help individuals of all ages develop the habits of inquiry and skills of expression that they need to be critical thinkers, effective communicators, and active citizens in today's world. The way we see it is to be a successful student, responsible citizen, productive worker, competent consumer individuals need to develop expertise with the increasingly sophisticated multisensory world. And media literacy represents a necessary, inevitable, and realistic response to this complex information and communication system that surrounds us. The way that we talk about media literacy is with 6 core principles. One being that media literacy requires active inquiry and critical thinking about the messages we receive and create. As I said before, it also expands on the concept of literacy to include all forms of media. It builds and reinforces skills for learners of all ages. So just like print literacy, those skills necessitate an integrated, interactive, and repeated practice. It's not something you can do in one assembly, right? Like, you really need to dedicate time throughout the school curriculum for these skill building. And it develops informed, reflective, and engaged participants essential for democratic society. It recognizes that media are a part of culture and function as agents of socialization. And it affirms that people use their individual skills, beliefs, and experiences to construct their own meanings from media messages. And a media literate person is curious, inquisitive, skeptical, is always asking questions about everything all the time, has their eyes and ears open, knows that media messages all have a point of view, and understands that media influence our behaviors and our beliefs. And as I mentioned, we are a diverse network of people and organization, the largest of its kind across the globe. We have 80 organizations within our umbrella. We have launched a National Media Literacy Alliance with 12 of the national teacher organizations, teachers of English, of science, of math, of social studies, of writing, of library science, to commit to working together to advance media literacy. We host Media Literacy Week. We have a research project going on right now to look at impact of media literacy, and we host a conference. Our next conference is coming up in July. But one of the things I really wanted to touch base on is that things really changed in 2016 for us and for the media literacy community. As I mentioned before, we started in 1997. We really saw the conversation about media literacy go from academic spaces to cultural conversation. And that was with the amplification of the term fake news. And fake news kind of came onto the scene. And we really started to feel there was this intense demand for work that we've kind of been doing for some time, our community. And so, as you probably know, false information has 70% a greater chance of being disseminated than the truth. And why is that? And it's because fake information, fake news is created to stir up emotions, and human brain is more triggered by emotion laden information. And this has certainly proved to be a problem with real life consequences, as we've all seen. But from our point of view, it's actually not the only problem with the fake news conversation. One of the problems that we see in the media literacy education space is that by talking about fake news, we tend to put information into 2 buckets. We want to label information true versus false, real versus fake, fact versus fiction. But the problem is that information is complicated, right? It doesn't just fall into 2 buckets, it falls into endless buckets. And information can be news, opinion, advertising, entertainment, satire, humor. Even if we just hone in on misinformation, it can be propaganda, clickbait, hoax, conspiracy theory, disinformation. It might just be inaccurate, right? So if we limit our understanding to simply a binary label, we are actually missing a deeper understanding. And the goal of media literacy is really to understand information, its purpose, its value, its audience, its bias, its agenda. And we strive to think deeper, to understand how media and information influence us, our beliefs, our values, our relationships. And media messages are impacting all of us. And so we need to think of media literacy as kind of a GPS to guide us through the complicated media landscape around us. And I have some other points to make, but I'll pause and start a conversation so that I don't just sit here and, be a talking head.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, we couldn't get your slides to work, but I think that
Yeah,
was a simple groundwork for what media literacy is. And we know that a big part of it is accessibility. And I think we're curious, how accessible is news? And in turn, how accessible is fake news and the things that people are consuming that get so confused? And how does access impact our understanding of what we're seeing?
Well, I think that's a large question, right? Because it obviously really does impact us. I think that what's interesting is that in a lot of ways, people have more access to information than we've ever had, although it's incredibly inequitable, as we know, and there's huge social justice issues just within who gets information, what kind of information they get, and how people are accessing or not accessing just broadband, right? You could do a whole nother webinar on that. But I think what's really, the access in some ways to information in general has become very simple. So people but the problem is they don't know how to discern what they're getting access to, and they don't understand how to kind of determine what is reliable, what is credible, where the source is, all of those things that journalists think about all the time. So I think access is, it's the first word in the definition of media literacy. Without access, we don't get any of the other skills. But it's kind of misleading in the sense that you can have access without having the media literacy skills to understand the information you're accessing. And then, of course, all of the issues with, underserved communities not having access, which we've seen obviously in a huge way during COVID.
And when you talk about access, what kind of tools do you see consumers using, or what tools should they be using to not only, maybe on their own terms, but maybe in the classroom, or, where should they be turning to kind of find the answers for this?
Do you mean like tech tools? Do you mean just, if you don't mind giving me a little information so I answer the question in what you're seeking?
Yeah, I guess kind of sort of like a mental checklist when they're running through this.
Yeah, so just to understand where their information is. Well, let me just tell you, let me go back to some of my prepared remarks. So one thing that I can say is that I think one of the interesting things that is happening in cultural conversation around mis and disinformation is it goes back to that binary framing that can be slightly dangerous in some ways, because if we're just going through the checklist, which is this fact, we're not doing a lot of kind of our own interpretation. And so we actually have key questions for analyzing media messages. And within that, there's 26 questions that we kind of encourage people to have in their, media literacy toolkit. And some of them, rather than is this, fact, it's who made it? Why was it made? Who was it for? Who might be harmed by it? What does it want me to think? What's left out that I should know? What techniques are being used? How might different people interpret this differently? And rather than just asking, is this fact? Asking, is this fact? Is this opinion? Is this something else? Because a lot of information out there is in this something else category, and we don't spend enough time just kind of thinking about what those other categories are. So I think checklists, it's interesting because yes, it's important to know where the source is and understand, simple things like, checking to make sure there's an author byline and making sure the date and making sure it's a valid website and making sure you're doing some lateral reading when you're, looking at documentation online. But just thinking deeply, it goes beyond kind of that checklist mentality and really makes you want to or urges you to reflect in some ways. And not that I think like the fact checking, all that stuff is super, super important, but one of the problems that, separating things into true and false is that if we think it's fake, then maybe we don't pay attention to it. And the truth is that we really need to understand fake information. We need to understand disinformation. We need to understand why it flows. What's the purpose of it? What is the agenda of the people creating it? That's really important to understand. So just ignoring false information can actually not allow us to truly understand the depth of that process of creating it and spreading it. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it gave someone something to think about.
So yeah, and I think with that in mind, would you be able to maybe expand a little bit more on maybe how you felt your job became more important from 2016 on?
Yeah, so I can say that I always joke, and this is like my running joke, that before 2016, nobody was calling me back. And just to have to like get someone to talk to me about media literacy, it was like cold calling. And it was like, let me explain to you what we're doing, why we're doing it. And it was really difficult to get people to pay attention. And then I think there were so many aspects of 2016 that led to people, recognizing not only the impact that fake information can have on us just simply by the fake information that was, spread during the election, but just the power of social media during the campaign. And also everything that came after the Cambridge Analytica, drama and scandal and all of those things that came after, like immediately people realized like, wow, we have a problem. How are we going to solve it? And many people said, well, maybe we need to be thinking about education and maybe we need to think about media literacy. So and I have to be honest with you, the people that we heard from most were journalists. And they weren't, not to cover our organization, but to say, hey, listen, can we help? Because journalists naturally understand how important a media literate society is. Like one of the biggest problems, that we have is that people cannot just, tell the difference between investigative journalism and like a quick tweet on something. Like, it's like they don't even understand how it's made, what happens, and why it's reliable and credible. And that's a huge problem. And so journalists really naturally were drawn to media literacy education. And we still work. We have one of our closest partnerships is with Reuters. They work very closely with us on expanding media literacy around the country because, they understand like a media literate society is going to help people understand journalism and trust journalism again. And that's so vital to all the things that we're talking about, and ultimately, to save our democracy, right? So I think that I think it clicked for a lot of people, the problems that we had been kind of anticipating for so long, and realizing, that there was nothing in place to help combat all of this on a national scale. So it just became more, I think our work, specifically our community's work, became just more valuable.
Thanks, Michelle. I think you make a really great point about journalists being aware and like naturally understanding this, but perhaps our audience is not quite there yet. And that's definitely the reason why we have this evening a panel of journalists who have been working in their respective fields, whether it be broadcast or digital, who can speak to their experiences. As student journalists, we've definitely had conflicts and people not quite understanding what our job is, how we make the stories that we make and why. And these conflicts opened our eyes to the need for this conversation. And so we're really looking forward to hearing yourself and Mary and Joy and Suzanne kind of talking about your own experiences. And so we'd love to dive right into kind of this media in motion and hear from some of our panelists about their experiences. And so I'll begin with Suzanne. You are a digital journalist, but you were a print journalist during your time at the Torch. Can you describe some of the differences between something like your employer, NBC News Digital, and a print publication?
Sure. And I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much again for having me tonight. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I will say, I mean, working for NBC News, it's a little more fast-paced than things were during my time at The Torch. We published once a week, we published our newspaper. And in the meantime, and I have to say, you guys have done a seriously amazing job keeping up the website and getting breaking news out faster, I would say, than we did back then. There's a lot of quick turnaround for the stories that, I usually report on every single day. And it's also, it's different now from my time at The Torch because, when I was at St. John's, like I sat in class with people that I was interviewing for stories. Like I was very close to the community. I'm sure Jill and Dara, you feel the same way. Like you're very in tune to the community you cover. It's like a very specific community because you're covering what's going on specifically at St. John's. In my work now, I'm connecting with people every single day from all over the world. For all sorts of different stories. And I wouldn't say it's harder to build trust with those sources, but it's different. It's different from, talking to people that you might see on campus every single day. It was a little bit easier, I would say, to build relationships with people at St. John's when I was a journalist there, as opposed to now, especially because, I'm a social news gathering reporter. A lot of the sources that I speak to for different stories I report on, I'm reaching out to them online. I don't have a previous relationship with them. So it's kind of like a brand new experience almost every single time, right? So yeah, sorry, I don't want to ramble here, but I would say those are some of the main differences.
Thank you. Could you maybe elaborate on what you feel like are the best practices for yourself as a journalist navigating an increasingly digital world, seeing as you might have to source people via Twitter or via Instagram, trying to get comments from them? Like, how do you navigate what is really a digital world at this point?
Yeah, definitely. And Michelle mentioned this earlier, being skeptical. That's like my favorite word. It's so important to stay skeptical, especially on social media. It's we see that there's so many things that get shared online that are false, and it's really hard to sift through things sometimes. I will say that a lot of different things that come up online, you can kind of do a quick Google search or maybe a reverse image search. We see a lot of different photos being shared during breaking news, especially where we might have questions about them. Do small things like that, like a reverse image search or just Googling something and maybe like looking it up, reading a little bit about it, can kind of help you figure out like what exactly is going on. And I will say, like, if you're reading something, looking at something online and like something doesn't feel right to you, you should probably go with your gut and do a little more research, ask more questions. If you're the reporter working on a story, we're supposed to ask questions. Like, don't be afraid to ask too many questions. And you just have to be really mindful of the things that people share and say online, and be very specific with your questions. If I'm like looking at a photo or a video and I want to ask an official source if they can confirm whether this video is from like a specific event, like I'll ask a few times, like I'll keep asking until I get some kind of answer from them, because you want to be sure that you are putting the correct information out there. And I will also say, in terms of like, we talk about like fake things being shared online, manipulated photos, videos, things like that. You also, if you're the journalist, want to be careful about the way that you report on those things. Obviously, if something is like really viral and it's false, it's important to debunk it, but also be mindful of how you're reporting on it so that you're not amplifying that false information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. I think that's a really key point in all of this. Making sure you're putting out the facts when they're needed. Just over to Mary, unlike Suzanne, all of your stories take place live on air mostly. There's no opportunity to make a correction until the next time you're on air again, maybe. So can you maybe talk about a time where you wish the information you relayed to the public could have been shaped differently? Maybe there was a time where you needed to make a correction, and how did you go about that?
Oh, sure, Jillian. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And Dayra, wow. I mean, kudos to both of you for doing such a phenomenal job with the torch and all of your work with this forum as well. And Professor Rizzo, I mean, what you're talking about is the reason why you are all working so hard. I mean, this idea of fake news and what we're putting out every day, it's so important to make sure that we are the credible sources. And so for us on the broadcast side, I'm on air for about 3 hours of live television a day. And the way it works, really, I think the more you do it, the better you get at it, and the more you can weave through the information that's preliminary and not ready for air. I mean, that's what's really important, is every time you go on air, you really have to, take a pause for a moment if you have to, because it's so important right now to make sure that the public trusts what we're doing. I mean, this idea of fake news that you're talking about, and Michelle and Suzanne, I really appreciate your comments, and they're so important to this day. But it's really fascinating, and I brought up an article that's way old because I thought you might enjoy it. It's just show and tell from the year 1756. So I'm just going to hold it up. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's the Maryland Gazette from 1756. And strangely, I came upon this because I was doing research on a story. The idea of journalism kind of, and it's just, the whole idea is like, you're constantly like curious about stories. Anyhow, this story is fake news about George Washington, and it was printed in all of the colonial papers, and it really like compares George Washington to like the worst leaders who've ever existed. I mean, he claims that he's a gambler, a womanizer. I mean, it talks about debauchery. It just goes on, but it was fake news in 1756. And I use this article in my research for a book that I wrote in regard to George Washington's first love. And it was quite fascinating to go back and realize that fake news has been around for a really long time. And so I think as journalists and as critical thinkers, we know to keep searching for the answers, not to just take something that's written on social media or even in like a colonial newspaper and not question what it is that we're looking at. And that's the important thing, is to know who the author is. I mean, why are they writing this? In regard to that article in 1756, it was written anonymously, so that might give you an idea. And I think a lot of social media is done anonymously. So if you don't actually know who you're reading these pieces from, then you might want to question exactly why they're writing it.
And when you talk about, taking that deeper dive, what about in breaking news situations when you're really just, you have to be on the move all the time, and you maybe, you're trying to get to the core of things, but you also need to move in a timely fashion. Like a lot of times it's not necessarily a competition amongst, different news organizations, but, you definitely want to get to the story first. So what kind of, considerations come into play when you're in the newsroom and you're trying to cover these stories that are really high impact, high urgency, but you still want to navigate about it in an ethical way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the important thing for broadcast is what you can see and hear. I mean, there are often times that we'll be looking at live video of an accident scene, and we are telling the viewers what we're seeing, along with what the viewers are seeing at that very moment. And we're very careful in describing what we know. And so we're trying, while we're on the air, getting source information and confirming that source information to be able to at least give the public preliminary details of what's going on at that very moment. There have been a number of breaking news stories that I was involved with. I mean, going back, to the first attack on the World Trade Center in the 90s that I was reporting on, and of course, September 11th. And we could go on and on about breaking news stories and covering them at length, including Newtown and so on and so forth. And a lot of them are very devastating, truthfully, and very tragic. And you really want to be very careful in how you're presenting this information, because you realize that families are watching this. I mean, victims' families are watching this. And so it's incumbent upon us to be very responsible in the way we're presenting the information and to make sure that we are accurate with all of the details, because it is completely unfair and unethical to be able to go on the air with information that you don't know for sure. So I really believe strongly that it's critical for us to develop journalism and young journalists to know that everything that you put out there has to be the truth. You have to live the truth. That is our world. Our world is the truth. And I think it's really important for us to take that and take that torch and run with it.
Thanks, Mary. I think you make a good point about the truth. I think that journalists were bound by the truth, sharing the truth with their audiences. I'm curious if you've ever experienced anything where the story you told, some people may think I think there's differing point of views, right? You're telling the truth, but somebody might say that you're not telling the truth. Like, how do you handle that as a journalist? You know you did the best job you could, but there's still parties out there that might say that their point of view wasn't reflected properly or things like that.
Well, I think all voices should be heard, certainly. And I think that there are going to be times where people feel like the way it's presented, it was unfair. I mean, if that was the case, I would probably go back and look at my work and say, was I unfair? I mean, is it possible that I could have told this story in a better way? And that certainly has happened over the years, where people come to me and say, I think you should have told this in a different way. And you know what? Sometimes they're right. And so I think that's how we grow as journalists. But I think the most important piece here is to know that you have to let all voices be heard in whatever story that you're covering. And but when it comes down to it, you have to do the very best job you can do. And you have to believe in yourself, and you have to go out there and make sure you tell the very best story you can tell. And once you do that, then there is no way that you can go home and not feel comfortable with what you're doing, because it's so critical at this time to have people like yourselves go out there and tell great stories. I mean, that's why we're here. It's just that the idea that we're constantly inquiring and want to know more and want to tell great stories. And I do think, though, I think as journalists, we need to criticize ourselves. I think we need to go back and look at what we're doing and saying, hey, I should have done it this way, I should have done it that way. And that's how we grow and improve. But I think that you have to get to a point where you have to be able to say that story that was printed in the paper is a great story and feel confident. Even if people are saying things, that's kind of how it is. I mean, sort of journalism is a bit of a battlefield. I mean, like, if you don't want to put on your armor and get out on the field, just don't go into the battle. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, so I think that we have to understand that, and we have to realize that people aren't going to like what we're doing a lot of times, and that's okay.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I think that as you have had tons of experiences in the newsroom and broadcast, Joy Brown, who also works at Newsday, has had a ton of experience. And you brought up a great point, Mary, about kind of holding ourselves accountable as journalists. And so, Joy, I'm curious, in all your time in the newsroom as a reporter, as an administrator, if there is a point in time that maybe you have seen neglect on behalf of a journalist or from a consumer standpoint that you could speak to us about?
Neglect? I'll talk about me. All right. And I also remind me to talk to you about truth as well. I think I may be contrarian on that issue. All right. First off, the only thing that I've ever had was my reputation. And that reputation has been to do the best job that I can do out there. When I make a mistake, to admit it. If I have to double back on something, I have to double back on something. And I just want to kind of point out, Newsday is a newspaper, but Newsday is actually the Newsday Media Group. And as part of the Newsday Media Group, you can see behind me, I'm actually in my son's bedroom. You don't want to see what's behind this at all, ever in life. But I write, I do broadcast, I do stories with our broadcast part of our organization. I do live webinars, I do events. It's a good thing my first job was in radio, because I think that that's the thing that got me going as far as I can right now. I was never quite purist in terms of being a newspaper. But do people make mistakes? Yes, absolutely. We all have a point of view. I remember when I was in school, and just to date myself here, I was a kid, and our advisor took us to the Washington Post. That's my hometown. And it's a big, big deal that Glenn Close knew what go-go music was and the butt on the Oscars. I can't tell you how big that was. And we went in there, and there had been a riot at one of the prisons. And DC was not a city back then. It was a federal prison. And the guy taking us through, he points to these two dudes sitting over, and one guy's got his feet up on the desk. And he's like, they're reporting an interesting story about a break-in at a big hotel downtown, and, over at the Watergate. And I remember saying, I don't care. I want to go talk to the dude who did the prison break, who did the prison riot. So that's how far back I go on this. All you have, you need to understand that you have a distinct point of view, whether you want to pretend to be unbiased or not. I grew up in a row house. To me, any house that was not attached was a mansion. I have since learned that that is not true. Everything that you have, you bring to bear. And when you do your job, your absolute and total best in terms of going out and talking to people, you hit the jackpot when you do two things. One, the person that you're speaking to allows you to see the world through their eyes. And that two, and you're repeating that through whatever medium it is, that you let somebody else see the world through their eyes as well. I hope that answers your question, but let's talk about truth though. Tell me when you're ready. You want to talk about truth? You ready?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
we're ready.
All right. I'm going to be a little contrarian on this truth thing for journalism. Somebody once asked me this question when I was giving a lecture at a school, and I turned around on the board and I wrote the word truth and I put it in a teeny tiny box. And I'll give you a great example of this. You only know what you know when you know it, and what that is might change over time. What is the truth in the George Floyd case? What were the initial police reports? That's probably the best thing I can tell you. What was truth there? There were people there doing the job, talking to people, talking to witnesses, talking to everybody, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they published something. Was that truth? That's why I put truth in a box. You only have available to you the best that you can get at that particular time, and what truth is, if we're lucky, will reveal itself over time, over the arc of a story. I think, I can't remember who, somebody famous said, we write the first draft of history. We also broadcast it, we podcast it, we tweet it, we do every other kind of thing. And we find out more truth, as it were, when somebody down the line looks backwards. But again, I'm going to be contrarian. I think that it's impossible, or almost impossible, for any reporter at one point in time to know what someone else's truth is. I think that is something that evolves. So yeah, I think that's what we want to do. I think that's what we try to do, but I still put truth in that little box in the corner there. What do you guys think?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think, going back to points you made before, yes, we all have that we all bring with us a different kind of view, and does that kind of shape the truth? Perhaps in some ways, and also maybe perhaps not even on the side of the journalist, but also on the side of the consumer. And that's why I think Michelle, I know you kind of have a personal connection to that. If you would want to speak to that, I think it would be really valuable to all of us in attendance to kind of share your personal connection and the way that you kind of had that experience with truth and what that meant to you.
Sure. I mean, it's always a little tough to start the story, but I kind of come to all of this work um, being part of a news story. So when I was 17, my father was killed aboard Pan Am 103 over Scotland. And I think once you become the family, as we talked about before, once we are starting to see our life play across our screens, you start to have a different relationship with the news and with the screen in general. And it happened in 1988. So there was no social media, there was no, quick information. We found out my dad's plane crashed from a breaking news story. And at that time it was actually breaking news, right? And we found out everything about the crash through the news. There was no channel just to the families. Every piece of information we got was from the work that journalists did. And as has been, mentioned, they didn't get it right at the beginning, and so we had to just take in what we could get. And it took such a long time. I mean, the truth is it's been over 30 years and there's still truth that needs to be known. So I have a very, very personal, connection with the idea of seeing a news story play out. Also is just over the years and over the decades, over and over again, with the investigation and with the lawsuits and with the Pan Am going out of business and with the bombers being arrested and the bombers being released, and then all of this stuff over and over again. And so to see your kind of life and your tragedy play out in the news, it just changes you as a human being, but it changes your relationship with media. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this work, because I didn't question anything. Like, I didn't know I was supposed to question anything. I believed everything the journalists and the news told me about my father's death. And the truth is that years later, we found out that, like, my dad, was not found in all the images that I saw over and over again in the news, and that his particular story was a little bit separate, end result obviously the same, but was separate from what I was seeing on the news. And that took years to find out. And I never knew I was supposed to ask questions. And so, I blame my public education in the 1980s in New Jersey for that. But, and that's one of the reasons that I just feel like it's so important for us to know that we're supposed to question and we're supposed to think deeply. And I do appreciate the sentiment of journalists thinking about the victims, because I don't get a sense that happens enough. And there's a lot of victims out there that are watching the news and watching, what is kind of developing about their own life story. And you couldn't be more careful. Like, you can't be, it defined my experience with my father's death, and it's just really important work.
Absolutely. And I think that story, I mean, for all the journalists in the room, like, hearing, both sides of it, someone who's been on that side, and now you are the one at the forefront of that, making that change for others. And, hearing from a journalist point of view, just how impactful the work we do is and how it affects not only people reading the story, but people who are the story. And I think from both sides, that just makes it even more important to fully read into the story, fully analyze, look at every single piece of information in there. And I think that's something that we're losing as time goes on, especially with social media. I kind of think we're all losing that being in tune to how close of attention we are paying to the story. We're just getting our news from social media feeds of, you know, a large portion of readers. So with that, I just want to kind of open up the floor to any of our panelists to ask, you know, why is reading past the headline so important? Why is taking that next step to actually analyze instead of just thinking you've read the headline and you've got the whole story? Why is that important?
Well, I mean, sorry, I can start. I mean, usually the headline, you know, the headline is written for a very, you know, specific reason, and it's to get us to pay attention to, you know, what's in the story, right? And the truth is that a lot, no offense to anyone out here who's written headlines, whatever, a lot of the time it doesn't completely match up with what is in the article. So first of all, you're not getting the real story. And, you know, you're fooling yourself if you feel like you know, anything about that particular topic. And I think that, you know, I think the most dangerous pattern of behavior is that not like we started this campaign, this media literacy campaign called Stop the Media Monsters. And one of our monsters is headline hellion. And it's this monster who basically like believes, you know, the first thing they hear about anything. So it's not just the headline, but just like we pick up a little piece of information and we think we know this. Oh, like I heard about that. It's blah, blah. And the behavior that we have to stop is thinking that we know anything based on one, you know, blurb of information. And, you know, if you don't have time to read the article, then you shouldn't assume that you know much of anything about the topic, and you should never share it. If you don't have time, it's not worth the share.
Michelle, can I jump in here
Yeah.
to sort of get the other flip side of that thing? It's interesting because in a newsroom these days, I write my own headlines for the columns, and I always get a big kick when the headline appears in the newspaper. And when I write my own headlines, they're actually for your cell phone more than anything else. But in addition to the headlines, we are all victims of metrics these days.
Yeah.
Metrics. I do a webinar, and 10 minutes after the webinar, they can tell you, I love it when I get 100%. 100% score on like 85,000 variables. One of the 100% scores will tell us that somebody kept that webinar on their screen for the entire time and didn't change their screen, right? So the metrics on the column that appears online, there are two interesting things to me. One is beating the average on how long people read. And I always beat the average, always. And number two is the number of people in the audience. You know, how many people actually read it? And I always beat the average number of people who read it. But to me, the most important part of that is how much time people took reading it. And they'll say, I can get 2 minutes. I've gotten 4 minutes because I like to put links in there too. So, you know, the trick for me as a writer, when I'm writing for newspaper or writing for the web, is I have to make it interesting enough so that people will not just come in. I got to grab their eyeballs every sentence, every word, every paragraph. I got to keep them going, keep them going, keep them going. And that's not an easy thing to do.
No.
At all. So metrics, I think, from the journalism side, ladies, I'm telling you, you're going to come up against this as well. It's fascinating that, yes, our average reader may read something, and I hope, I pray to God I don't get this wrong, 15 seconds, maybe 15. So a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, or 4 minutes is extraordinary. So that makes me set my bar high. So I don't want you, Michelle, to just read the headline. I need to sucker you in all the way through.
I love that. It's funny. We work with TikTok, and the magic number on TikTok is 18 seconds. If you don't get them in 18 seconds, they're not paying attention. It's just like, wow, it's a lot of pressure.
That's a lot of pressure. Yeah, it is. It absolutely is.
Yeah.
I could chime in on the broadcast side. I mean, we're 15-minute cycles, so we're very different. So we're talking 15 minutes of television, and that's the whole, that's what we're looking for. So think about the difference when you're talking about seconds to like 15 minutes, a quarter. We go by quarter hours in regard to the ratings process in television. And I wanted to add, Michelle, one of the reasons I went into television news was the Pan Am 103 accident. I was at Syracuse University. I lost a number of my dear friends on that flight. And I think that my approach to journalism was really formed at that time because we were living in the same house, and journalists came knocking on our door looking for interviews. And when you're going through such a difficult time, these were my friends. I mean, you certainly had it much more difficult, I would imagine, being from what you're saying with your dad. I'm so sorry about that. And we, as a group of young students, these were 35 students from Syracuse. They were like risk takers and dreamers and going overseas, and to not have them come back was really difficult for us. And I think for those who became journalists from my group of friends, we certainly approach journalism in a very serious way because we understand the depth of it and the seriousness of it. And so I just wanted to let you know that, that was very important for me at that time, very difficult time to go through. And I'm just sorry to hear about that with your
It
dad.
actually makes so much sense that you think of the people you're writing and working on stories about. Like that makes so much sense that you are that like empathetic and sensitive to it.
I think that, and for those who are on the call, on the forum right now, and a lot of times when you're covering stories, you're going to homes of families who've lost loved ones. And there were so many times, I mean, I don't know, maybe hundreds of times that, I was knocking on the door of those who had lost someone. And it is really important for us as journalists to be very careful and understand what it is that we're doing here. I mean, we're telling stories and we're on a deadline, certainly, but it's so important to understand what's behind the story and the families who are being affected by it. And certainly, Michelle, no one can tell that better than you. And so thank goodness we have you leading a group in regard to media literacy and making sure people are doing the right thing when it comes to journalism and telling these stories.
Thank you. I have to say that that's one of my most vivid memories is the journalists kind of pouncing on us afterwards, and they were really looking for angry people. They wanted and we were just so shocked and sad that we were we didn't give them what they wanted, and it's interesting because I've done a lot of media since it happened, and I did like Nightline pieces and BBC documentaries, and just because I felt like the story was not being told there was a whole part of the story that I didn't think got told enough, and I wanted to be part of telling that story. And luckily there were journalists and producers who felt like agreed that part of the story needed to be told, and it was it was the more human side. It was the families in Scotland, and it was the care and the healing, as opposed to the horror. And it was great to have like the choice and the power to be part of the storytelling too, to be able to say, it doesn't work that like this is not being covered like this, and so can I help it be covered? That was a very empowering, a very empowering opportunity for someone who was on the victim side of a story, to be able to help build the narrative around it.
I often tell our interns that in this business, most of the people you will meet them either on the best day of their life or on the worst day of their life. And you need to be very, very, very cognizant of that. You need to be very understanding of that. The other thing I tell my mentees, I've told them over decades now, is that when you're in a situation like that, you want to be where everyone isn't. Be where everyone isn't. You're going to get whatever the pack got. You go someplace else. You find someplace else. And the other thing I tell my mentees is that I think that we have a terrible habit, an incredible habit of turning people into cardboard caricatures. You know, what is a victim? What is a family? You know, what is a perpetrator? You know, up until that particular point in time, you know, they may have had a mortgage, a car, and, you know, like Cheetos from the 7-Eleven. I have absolutely no idea that. I think when we do that, we do a disservice to the people that we're trying to give a picture out to. Remember, I said at the beginning, at our best, when you're talking to somebody and you're interviewing somebody, I don't ask questions. I try to have a conversation. I want to see what they're saying. I want to hear what they're hearing, smell what they're smelling. And sometimes you get lucky enough to be able to do that. Then you have some idea of what understanding is, rather than, yeah, I got to go see the Vic, or yeah, I got to go talk to the family, asking the same things. They have things to tell you, not necessarily things that they want to answer. And you need to understand that. And that takes some maturity, it takes some presence, it takes some skill, it takes some doing this an awful long time too. But I think that's one of the things that kind of still drives me crazy on these stories, right? He was a good boy. You know, we didn't know our neighbor. I mean, how many of these tropes are we going to get? You know, people aren't tropes. We can do better.
I think that's a really good point. I think, you know, from the broadcast side, from the front side, Joy, and from Michelle, all of your experiences, you know, you kind of have that more, you're more tapped into the emotional side because you're seeing these people in person. Suzanne, I know your work, you're not getting to necessarily see these people in person. You're reaching out through a tweet, you're reaching out through a comment. You don't have the opportunity to kind of engage with them until they accept that they want to engage back with you from that one simple motion. So how do you kind of balance that? How do you, you know, like manage that emotional touch when you're reaching out to people who are involved in tragedy, or people who, you know, directly reported something that they were a part of, and now you need to ask them the best way to relate this story?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really tough, honestly. It's really tough to reach out to people. Like you said, you know, I'm not going to someone's house and even seeing them in person and talking to them. It's hard to create a connection with someone over social media. And, you know, I've encountered situations where people don't even believe I'm a journalist sometimes when I'm reaching out to them initially. And you know, it can be really difficult. I try to, you know, I always try to put myself in the other person's shoes and kind of think about it from the standpoint of like, if this was happening to my family, someone I love, like, how would I want the journalist to approach the situation? How would I want them to treat this person, especially when you first reach out to them? Again, it can be really tough. And that's kind of how I approach it. You know, I reach out to a lot of people, especially via Twitter, and I just try and start, you know, I know oftentimes when there's breaking news, there can be like a handful of people online that you see like lots of journalists reaching out to all at once to talk to, whether they've posted information about something that's going on, photos, videos, things like that. And I try to, you know, first just like reach out to them and just see like, how are they? Like, are they safe? Are they like okay? Are they even in a position where they could speak to me? And then kind of take the conversation from there. And you know, like Joy was saying, I believe, you know, not necessarily like bombard them with questions, but kind of try to have a conversation with them. And oftentimes, you know, those conversations start out, you know, in a private message. And you kind of like feel out the situation and see like how comfortable they are. Like, you know, can we move to a phone call? Things like that. But I would say like, yeah, I just try and put myself in that person's shoes and think about like, how I would want a journalist to approach a story if it was happening to me or to somebody that I care about.
I think that's a really good point. And I'd imagine that a lot of the people you've reached out to over the past year have likely maybe been involved in protests and reaching out to people involved in protests, you know, across America, but also during your time of the torch, you also have to cover student protests. So maybe would you be able to speak a little bit about what that's like and how you kind of dealt with that?
Sure. Yeah, and that can also be like difficult too, especially like for me, sometimes I'm reaching out to people and people are like literally like out in the street. And it's hard to do that sometimes when you're like talking to somebody over social media. Um, I will say that like especially now, like in my job now, as opposed to like my time at the Torch, like I'm reaching out to people that are located in all, you know, different parts of the country. And I think it's really important to like to you know to like hear from them about things that are happening like within their own community, like why are they there, like what, you know, what kind of experiences have they had within their own community, instead of just approaching it just from like, you know, like this like wide umbrella of like protests. You know, like try and like learn more, get more context from them about like what's going on in their community, why is it important to them, um, and things like that. I mean, it was similar at the Torch and at St. John's, but it was like again, like I was saying earlier, it's a little bit different because like, you know, you're really like tuned into the community there, being a student there. So it's a little bit harder now, but that's kind of how I approach it.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that like a large question that was kind of developed last summer for a lot of consumers in watching coverage of things like protests when people were kind of glued to their TV screens was the question of, do journalistic ethics ever change? Do we ever blur people's faces out? Do we ever use completely anonymous sources? And those were questions that the Torch had to kind of reconcile with and try and figure out as student journalists. And so I think the question that we'd really like to hear from everyone is, you know, do journalistic ethics ever change? What should change about journalism, about the way that we approach these types of situations that really affect people, while still wanting to do our jobs and tell the story that everybody needs to hear?
Well, I'm going to jump in here quickly, and I know you all have some good stuff, but before we get to the ethics, I think you got to understand that technology has changed. That and you know, we should talk about this. Technology changed. So the picture of me standing there in the middle of the street when I'm 18 years old with a sign that says something that maybe my grandmother would not like me to say, that could be in the next Google search when they're looking for a job. You know, newspapers had to come to terms with that, things like that, for mugshots, for things like that. You know, once it's on the web, it's going to be eternal. So your situation is a lot different, or the situation now is a lot different from the way it used to be. Where, you know, common thing was, hey, you're in public, you're on the street, I'm in public, I'm on the street, bam, it's all fair game. And Newsday, by the way, just won a huge, huge prize for the video and photographic coverage of more than 200 demonstrations that happened here. And one of the things that the judges remarked was how close our photographers, videographers got to the people in the protests. So ethnic, you know, I think it's as it always was, which is if it's out there, it's fair game, and that's the way it is. But you have to kind of knead into that the reality that, you know, what people may want to, people don't think that anything on their Twitter is going to be there forever. It's locked in somewhere forever. So I think you're kind of seeing a clash between the two, maybe. So no, I wouldn't black anybody out though. Nope, they were there.
I think also something else about the technology, which is really interesting, is that I can follow journalists as they tweet like that line, like for some reason, Maggie Haberman is like coming to mind, and just like following her on her Twitter. Like there are times where I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know if I should know everything all the time, Maggie. Like, and that's a really interesting dilemma. It's just like, you know, your where does the journalist stop and the human being and, you know, on these social media sites. And I'm sure there's like really, you know, really significant conversation and ethics about what you share and what you don't, and how you communicate with your followers. And I think that that's a whole other level of thought that journalists have to put in on, you know, which is, I think, a lot of pressure and a lot of, they're very much trapped in that journalism frame where they might not be able to be the person, you know, like they're not that they're not a person, but you know what I mean? Like who the persona that they are on social media is tied up in their career, as some people, it isn't, you know, as much.
Yeah, I'm curious if anyone, if any of you guys ever try to like, you know, do you ever look at the comments perhaps on your organization's news post and see what people are saying, and maybe, you know, think perhaps I should have reconsidered, or was there any room for me to change this, or things like that, especially just everything being digital and millions of people can comment. Like, where do we draw the line of, like, Mary had said earlier, just being proud of the work that we put out and knowing that it was great, and also kind of looking at all of these voices coming at us at the same time, telling us the ways that we should change.
I thought that was an interesting flip side of what Michelle was saying. She was saying, what you put out there, the flip side of that is what you get back.
Yeah.
Right. So, do I read all of the comments? I mean, people say things that are wrong, and I know that people are saying things that are wrong. Any personal attack, I'm going to judge it as a personal attack. It doesn't mean anything about my work. The thing that makes my heart stop is, and it wouldn't be, by the way, on a Facebook comment, it would be on an email, is something that I got wrong. That's a game changer right there, because I beat myself up about that for like weeks after. I still do that. But overall, you're going to write things that people aren't going to like, or you're going to write things that people felt didn't well, let me try this a different way. When I used to work in an office pre-pandemic, and somebody would call raging on the phone, right? If you wanted to curse at me, that was fine. I wouldn't listen to you. I would say, hey, you took the time to call. What is the problem? What do you want to talk to me about? And I would actually get people to try to talk to me. You can't get rabid people to talk to you, but I have learned things from people who disagreed or felt I didn't have enough context in there, or who felt I didn't go far enough in one direction or went too far in the other. I have learned a lot from my critics, so much so that now when I'm doing something that's going to be critical of someone, I call them in advance, because I can do that. And I always say to them, and they appreciate this, hey, I think what the supervisor did was really stupid. And I'm going to say, so talk me out of it. I always say, talk me out of it. And what I'll get back sometimes are people saying, okay, let me give it a try. And they'll yada, 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 yada. And then at the end of it, they go, how am I doing? And I'll say, at least I tried, but thank you for listening. So I do think there's something to reading the comments. I think there's something to putting them in the bins where they belong. Some things, I wrote something about what influence did the George Floyd verdict have on Long Island. I got one email this morning and it said the black thugs. I just immediately deleted it. That's not gonna, there's no value to that for me, either as individually or as for my work. There's just no value. So kaplink. On our Newsday Facebook page, my colleagues are very unhappy with what they're seeing, but it's not unexpected what they are seeing. There's nothing in what they're seeing of angry people or anything that is going to fundamentally change what we did, why we did, whether it was accurate or whether it was inaccurate. So I think you have to do that. Do you like somebody saying, Joy Brown is a moron? unless it's my kid. No, I don't like it that way either. But, we're people in these bodies. And people are going to come at you, and the discourse now is coarse. So of course there's going to be some reaction to that. And you guys are trapped with your audience on a campus or in a community there. I'm kind of trapped with my audience on an island of almost 3 million people. They know who I am. They know where to find me, So it kind of circles always back to this idea of, I'm only as good as my reputation. And the fun part is when people actually get on there and defend me. I like those people a lot.
Joy, I could just add to that. First of all, we're learning all your secrets now. So now we know exactly how you're operating, which is really a joy to listen to, Joy. But I wanted to add something too, that sometimes those comments can lead to other stories. So
Yes.
let me give you an example. We do, of course, a lot of stories in regard to the vaccination effort. And, I had done a story in regard to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine when it was starting to come out. And I got an email that was very critical of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because a family member was hospitalized after getting the vaccination and went into this whole situation in regard to blood clotting, and was highly critical of the story, saying that it's not safe. Okay, so now, of course, then, being that we are journalists, then I looked into that story, and it turned into another story, of course. And we know what happened with Johnson & Johnson being delayed. Now it's back, but there is a benefit to listening to these critical thoughts. And Joy, as you mentioned, people are taking time to comment. Why are they taking time to comment? Because they have a personal connection to what it is that we're saying. Now, of course, as you had mentioned, yes, some of them you just delete. However, a number of them I think are important to listen, and it's so critical for us to hear the different voices. And again, just like it happened to me, some of them can lead to these other stories. So definitely keep an open mind, and understand why it is that people are commenting, and accept what they are saying. And sometimes it could really help improve the work that we do.
Thank you all. I think we're going to toss it to Professor Rizzo because we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session. Folks sent in questions beforehand to ask our panelists, and some folks have commented in the Q&A as well. So we're looking forward to hearing what questions everyone has for you guys.
Thank you, Dayra. So yeah, we're in our final 15 minutes. So we've got a lot of interested people out there who want to ask some questions. I'm going to begin with Suzanne. And Mike asked an interesting question. You talked about the faster pace at NBC than your days at the Torch. How do you slow down so that you're doing good journalism and not rushing through the work that you need to do?
It's a good question, an important question. I have to say, like, first and foremost, I, work with a lot of great people at NBC, a lot of colleagues who, what we do is like very collaborative. And I think we all kind of like slow each other down, and force each other to ask questions, and like stay skeptical of our own work. I sometimes read things a million times before I will, send it on to other people that I work with, for reporting. I I think, I think that that's really important, and I would recommend, to all of the students who are listening, like, journalism is not, it's really like a team thing, right? It's a collaborative effort a lot of the time, and it's really important to, talk to your colleagues, because sometimes questions come up that like you might not even think of, especially if you're very like tuned into a story, but somebody else isn't, right? Like think about that, for example. We're responsible for telling these stories to our readers and viewers who, they're coming to us for this information. And so it's really good to just, bounce things off your colleagues, and have conversations with them. And a lot of times you get questions and answers, things that you weren't necessarily thinking about before.
Great. Mary, I want to come to you because Tony asks, there's a lot of blurred lines these days between people on television who are commentators and people on television who are journalists. So could you speak about how at CBS2 or Inside Edition, you're not becoming a commentator, but you're sticking to your journalism in all the reporting that you're doing?
Oh, sure. And I think especially the people who are involved in the forum understand what it is that they're watching or listening to. A lot of the news that's on now is commentary, and that's really how they make their money. You know, that's what they are. And so I think that it's really important to understand what it is that you're watching and what it is that you're listening to. And so I think overall, most people have a good idea as to where they want to get their news. But as long as you're comfortable with like wherever you're getting your news, if you know that they're commentators, then they're commentators and it's opinion television, and that's okay. It's just sort of like in a newspaper, you're reading the editorial page. I mean, so as long as you understand what it is that you're getting the news from. Now, when it comes to where I am, I mean, we're going through layers of editorial work, not to be an editorial page. And so these editorial groups are looking at it to be as absolutely unbiased as possible. And so what you're going to see on CBS is going to present both sides of the story as well as Inside Edition. And so I think it really comes down to the viewer knowing what it is they want to watch. And so some people love, you know, watching opinion television, and that's where they get their news. And that's where you have to be careful, because if you're going to get your news from opinion television, you just have to realize that it's going to maybe skew toward the opinion of those who are presenting it.
I would just add, if you don't mind, that I think part of the problem is we need to do a better job educating people about those different, different methods of delivering information, right? And this is why it's a great point, because it's why we need media literacy education, is that, I know highly intelligent people that get their news, watch the news at night, and it's just like the single person, some of it is obviously journalism, but some of it is just thoughts that people are just saying, and people don't understand it. So it's like, what can we do to educate people around that is something that I'm always asking myself, so that people do understand those important points.
Thanks, Michelle. So Joy, I want to come to you next. And Tom asks, newspapers are not doing as well as they used to in the past. And you mentioned Newsday is a multimedia corporation now. But are you feeling the pressures in print when you're using your online presence to try to get more clicks or followers or people to basically go to the website to read those stories? And how do you deal with that to not become then just clickbait?
Well, for me, that's pretty simple. I just don't do it. Believe it or not, on my Twitter, I do not link to my own stories. My colleagues do. And I'm happy that they do, but I don't. I use Twitter as a way to get information. I use Twitter as a way to exchange information if I need to exchange information. But in terms of, seeding the ground for clicks, I don't do that at all. I've killed my Newsday Facebook page. I don't use that at all. Again, I feel absolutely, and I'm a throwback. I feel no urgency to be a personality in social media. I think I read Maggie Haberman just like you do, right? She says some stuff I would have never said in a million years. Because I think that my overarching goal is to be approachable. I want anybody to be able to come and get me. I got a letter last year that I gave to my boss because it's kind of cool. And what it said was, I can't tell whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, or whether you're a liberal or you're a conservative. And I think there's a reason for that. And it's something that Michelle said. When you're talking about opinion, I'm a columnist, right? And columnists are supposed to have opinions, but everybody has an opinion these days. If I want a new pen, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to check for everybody else's opinion. So I don't even do that anymore. I'm more of an explainer. I put things in context. I reach out to different people and have them talk about things. I reach out to the unreachable. Nobody's talking. Well, Joy's going to get them to talk. That's what I do. And that's where I found my niche in this little market over here. And as I say, I do it for broadcast. I do these webinars, and I do it for a column that appears in print. But most of them, all my metrics come from online. So I hope that kind of tries to answer your question. Other people, I don't want to trip over me being me or not being me being a professional and me not being a professional, because believe it or not, they're two different things, right? When I'm not working, I'm not working. Period, end of story. That's it. Doesn't happen a lot, but hey.
Thanks, Troy. Michelle, we have a question from the audience. What should the relationship between news consumers and journalists be in 2021?
Ooh, I think it should. I mean, I think that journalists have a lot to do. So I think I'd be concerned that whatever my answer would make their job harder. I think that it is. Like, part of me just feels like it's like the education role to teach consumers about journalism so that they can better navigate that space, and then know. That's a really hard question. I think you stumped me. I think that it's, I would say that I think the general public probably expects a little bit too much from journalists, in the sense of their expectations of the work that you do is like, I'm sure it's challenging and it can drive you, but it also seems relatively unreasonable that, you fear getting everything right all the time, regardless of how quickly things happen. So I think that how I would like to answer that is that I think journalists should focus on their journalism, and consumers should educate themselves and get to know all the different types of information and really hone their media literacy skills, so that if they do interact with journalists, like in social media spaces, that they can interact with them in educated ways.
I would go the opposite way, believe it or
Go
not.
ahead.
I would say, and I would bring this down to communities. I think communities can and should make demands upon their, a news organization isn't one journalist, right? The Torch isn't one person or the editor. And God love you, ladies. I was editor of my student newspaper. I know your pain. So I think that, if I come into your space and I got something wrong, it's okay for you to tell me I got that wrong. If look at what we're seeing right now in terms of an explosion of news about all kinds of different people. What did we care about Asian Americans being discriminated against, say, 18 months ago? There was an audience that made a demand on the institution, an audience that made a demand on journalists, and I'm glad that they made the demand. We shouldn't have to wait until what's happening is happening. So there are plentiful audiences out there that can and should make demands. What I fear is that we as a profession have become so closed off, right? We are journalists. I even hate the word journalist. I like reporter, because that's what I do. That's my fear. I think that the more you're connected to the community, the better off you are. And the less that you're connected to community, it's okay for the community to make demands upon you. If your job is to educate, for example, or inform, or even titillate, or make somebody whatever, it's okay. It's got to be a two-way. It already is a two-way street, whether you want it to be or not, right? Right, ladies? Tell me I'm wrong.
Okay, I think we could actually probably keep talking for quite a long time, but we're at the end of our session. I do want to hand it back over to Dara and Jillian for just a few comments. Then I'll come back for just a closing remark, and then we'll call it a night. So Dara, Please go ahead and take it.
Thank you, Professor Rizzo. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for attending this evening, and a special thank you to Michelle, Joy, Suzanne, and Mary for engaging in this conversation with us. Joy, you make a great point. It's like we should be open to our communities, to hearing from them and hearing what they want from us. And so we here at the Torch encourage you to ask us questions, to ask the journalism program questions, to try and figure out how you should be consuming the media that we present to you and that is presented to you all the time. And we really hope that this conversation has facilitated some questions brewing in your mind. Beyond that, please keep an eye out for a special media literacy edition of the Torch newsletter in your inboxes, and please consider donating to our publication to help us continue our hard work. Thank you all again for attending, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Jillian, anything to comment?
Yeah, I just seriously cannot say thank you enough. Thank you to all of our panelists. You guys are more than amazing, and to think that this event is now coming to a close, it happened, couldn't be more ecstatic. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
I'll make it a triple by saying thank to all our panelists for giving your time, as was mentioned early on, and once again to Jillian and Dara for their hard work, their idea to make this happen. So they deserve a lot of thanks for this and a lot of kudos for their work. We need good journalism more than ever. In a world where there's so much information, we need good journalism to help us maneuver through the noise so we can make informed decisions about so many topics. If we aim for that, I think that's a great way to end. Thank you all again. Good night to everyone. Thanks for participating and for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, good night.